Sampaio, who's going
Okay.
to talk to us on data portraits. So this is on
I will start to share.
Yes, this is visualization of personal data.
Yes. Okay. So can you see?
Yes, that looks fine. It's great.
Okay. So I think that this will be a change of subject. We will be moving a few years forward, and the story that I'm here to tell you starts in the end of the 90s. And okay, so let's go. So as I told you, my name is Catarina. I'm a PhD student in fine arts in the specialization of communication design at the University of Lisbon. And Luísa Ribas, that is the other name in the paper, is my supervisor. My research focuses on the creative exploration of personal data as raw material for the creation of portraits. It takes into account how currently almost all human activity leaves a trace of identified or identifiable digital data that can be used to accurately refer to a certain individual. Following this idea, this research addresses the creative possibilities that are associated with data portraits as means of expressing identity according to a theoretical, analytical, and practice-based approach. To this end, it begins by theoretically framing the notion of data portrait as the representation of personal identity by means of data visualization. It then analyzes the diversity of the creative approaches to data portraiture by focusing on their representational and expressive functions. And finally, the practice-based approach of the study involves the design of a data visualization system that is capable of producing a self-portrait generated from personal data and as an expression of one's identity. With this approach, this research seeks to explore design solutions that take advantage of the objectivity of data to represent human subjectivity in an increasingly technologically mediated life. So the work that I'm going to present now concerns the analysis of a selection of data portraits as works that comprise different methods for visualizing personal data while addressing their representational and expressive functions and describing their data and mapping processes, as well as the outcomes that can be experienced by the audience or the user. So, but first let me begin by introducing the notion of data portrait and explain why personal data becomes relevant in portraying identity. So the first notable experiences around data portraits appeared in the end of the 90s, associated with the need of graphically representing participants in online discussion groups. One of the first examples was the project People Garden, which used the garden metaphor to convey how users' behavior changes over time. In this sense, data portraits are a product of the quantification and the visualization of data that is produced in the course of daily activities and automatically captured by technologies of personal use. So this data becomes a kind of digital fingerprint that is unique to each individual. As such, and although different from traditional portraits, data portraits evoke the same functions of their classic counterparts as essentially tied to the representation of the subject before the other and or before himself. On one hand, they can fulfill a proxy function by representing individuals in online communities, revealing their behavioral patterns and having an impact on how others act towards them. On another hand, they can act as data mirrors or portraits that are designed to be seen only by the subject as a tool for self-understanding. Data portraits can also fulfill a political role by drawing attention to the loss of privacy and control over private information. And finally, data portraits can also promote an affective tie with one's personal data as an effect of its instantiation and due to its biographical qualities. So, in order to understand the diversity of data portraits, we analyze a set of artifacts according to the following criteria. So the analysis will focus on works that A, address the visual representation of personal identity, B, use personal data as raw material resulting from the subject's daily activities or bodily functions, and therefore C, resort to computational means for collecting, analyzing, and visualizing data. The analysis seeks to highlight features these works share and how they diverge, considering the following dimensions. On a conceptual level, we consider how the choice of data defines the theme and content of the data portrait. Therefore, we focused on the type of personal data used, highlighting their autoethnographic value or how data can convey a wide range of information about the subject as means of expressing identity, namely by revealing patterns of behavior, social relationships, physical or even psychological characteristics, and even information about their environment. We also distinguish between self-portraits, individual portraits, and collective portraits, as well as the motivations for their production, which can be exploratory, reflexive, or applied to a product or service. At the level of their mechanics, we examine the means of data collection and the data analysis processes, and whether they are manual or automated. This involves distinguishing between passive and active modes of data collection and whether it is a deliberate or a non-deliberate process. We also address the time of the data collection and the dataset assembly, as well as the input methods and the mapping processes involved. Finally, we address what is made accessible for the audience or the users to experience in terms of surface and dynamics. The surface comprise the outcomes of these projects and the output media formats and the modalities of expression, while also considering their level of abstraction and the legibility of the information that is portrayed. In turn, the dynamics concern the overall behavior of the output and the level of interactivity. So we observed how the concepts and the intent behind each data portrait are tied to the main functions of the data portraits that we mentioned earlier. Depending on the data that they resort to, acting either as proxies or as mechanisms of self-observation through self-tracking, or as means of reappropriation of personal data that is scattered in several networks and platforms. Many of the works analyzed act as self-portraits or tools for self-observation enabled by self-tracking. As such, they use computational technologies to highlight patterns arising from the personal data, thus enabling self-governance through data. Concerning their type and the motivation for their production, individual portraits often fulfill a political role pertaining to the aggregation and reappropriation of personal data. They often resort to big data and highlight aspects related to privacy and security by raising questions about who owns the data we produce. These kinds of portraits are often pieces of speculative design presented in artistic contexts, while in turn, individual portraits based on self-tracking usually have a functional purpose and are conceived as products or services. On the other hand, collective portraits often function as online proxies of the individuals, replacing their physical presence in digital environments. They usually track behavioral patterns in online communities, hindering deceitful self-representation. Data portraits often use data related to one's actions and biometric data to allow us to infer psychological characteristics of the individual, namely emotions. To this end, some projects resort to one type of data, while others correlate various types in order to express different aspects of the subject's experience. Considering their mechanics and their methods for data collection and processing, we notice that the data is often collected in a passive but deliberate way by means of self-tracking. However, personal data is also collected in a non-deliberate way, mainly when the aim of the portrait is to highlight the loss of control over private information. Considering the methods of data analysis, we notice that most data portraits resort to statistical analysis, thus quantifying various aspects of the individual's daily experiences to promote self-knowledge. On the other hand, projects like data portraits that we are seeing now tend to highlight the creative possibilities associated with the concept of transmutation of digital data, meaning mapping or translating anything into anything else. Given that our selection privileges computational data portraits, the mapping processes tend to be automated. Still, some projects rely on manual mapping, like in Mood plus Quantify, which is a visual record of mood and biofunctions that are digitally recorded but physically represented. At the level of their surface, many of the projects analyzed use hierarchical, temporal, or spatial temporal informational structures. The temporal dimension is highlighted in order to express the variable nature of human experience over time. In terms of their representational stance, most data portraits privilege expressiveness over legibility, in spite of using common informational structures for visualizing the data. Often the visual outcome is abstract, thus distancing from an analytical stance concerned with the legibility, favoring a subjective expression and promoting contemplative experiences. And although digitally produced, most data portraits have a material output, be it a printed image or a physical object, often complementing each other. Dynamic output formats like videos or online interfaces or apps, which can be interactively explored, are less common. Concerning their dynamics, static outcomes are in some cases complemented with a time-based visualization as an evolving data portrait that unfolds in real time. So, in conclusion, we have seen how data portraits prioritize aspects of identity that are not directly observable, relating to actions, behaviors, and psychological traits, and highlight the expressive potential of data as raw material for portraiture. Accordingly, although data portraits are basically based on numbers, or quantitative, abstract, and algorithmically generated, they have the ability to evoke the individuality of the subject in ways that are not completely accessible to traditional forms of portraiture. In particular, by mapping the human experience over time, they can express the fluid nature of identity as it is shaped by the continuous flows of information that we create and that we are exposed to. Even if a number of data portraits rely on methods of statistical analysis, they favor a subjective expression over the legibility of data. Thus, they can be seen as visualizations of subjectivity, but also visualizations of a subjective nature regarding the design choices on what it is to be represented and how, as well as to what end or expression. As such, they call into question the claims of transparency, certainty, and objectivity of data visualization, insisting on the situatedness of the observer and the phenomenon that is being observed. They can be means to better understand ourselves and others, but also means to raising questions about the role that technology plays in our daily lives, constantly capturing data in ways that often escape our awareness and control. So, as an ongoing research on the potential of our digital footprint for the representation of identity, this research also seeks to contribute to a reconceptualization of portraiture as a means of representing identity, one that is more attuned to our contemporary mode of living, immersed in data. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure to participate in this year's conference. If you have any questions, please.
Thank you very much, Catarina. That was a great presentation in these pandemic times when we're becoming more and more digital. And perhaps with respect to the last presentation, we have Wikidata and Wikicommons. Perhaps we could have a project to actually put visualization of digital personalities onto some of these platforms that already exist.
Yeah, true.
The other thing it made me think of was Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials with Everyone's Demon. Perhaps these visualizations are our digital demons that go around with us. That's
yes,
just a thought.
Some of them.
Yes, yes. Does anyone else have any comments, questions? We've got a minute or two if anyone does, but we're keeping fairly well to time. So do type things in on the chat and or Q&A buttons at the bottom of your screen. You can do that at any time because we'll try and monitor it. And maybe if you don't think of a question immediately, you're welcome to put in a question later, and we'll see if anyone wants to answer it. Any other comments from anyone?
I would only like to add my fascination to your paper, because really it was incredibly inspiring. And I was wondering, from your analysis, do authors tend to use some tools, some software tools more than others to produce this kind of portraits, of data portraits, or everyone uses his or her own tool?
I found that they are very broad technologies involved, and some of them I wasn't able to tackle every aspect of the technologies that were involved, because some of them are very complex projects, and especially the ones that are applied to services or in particular in self-tracking. I didn't get that information so that I could analyze that. So that's not a part of this analysis. I would like to complement this analysis, to expand this analysis in the future, maybe to have that kind of information. But for that, I think I would have to make some questions to the persons that produce these artworks or these software.
Okay, well,
but it's a very interesting question. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. thank you to all our speakers, including me, for keeping to time. We're doing very well on that aspect. Thank you especially to Catarina. I'll give you a little clap. There you go. It's a bit sad online that we can't hear some proper clapping, I think, but perhaps we will do better for the next time if we have. There we go. Except Graham is muted.
For you.
Mute. You have to unmute Graham. So we can have a little clap together. There we go. That's better. Yeah. Thank you. So that's the end of our morning.